I was a television producer on a program called Weekend World. It was a pretty serious current affairs television program. I'm sure that I'm not denying that there was scope for serious programming on television, which now has virtually ceased to exist in Britain, just as I'm not denying that there was a use for the screen. One of the problems, of course, in British television, this is a side thought, in pursuit of this young audience, which has deserted the television screen for the computer screen, the television companies are dumbing down their products more and more, making the trash even trashier. A program like Weekend World could no longer exist now. So it is a relentless pursuit of lower standards. Surely we could all agree that it's a good thing that children have access to computers in a controlled and rationed environment. All the sensible parents I know for years, and their children getting rationed television, and even made arrangements among themselves to ration television. So when the brats said, no, Emily down the road is allowed to watch, Dad and Mum would say, don't tell fibs, we know she isn't, and you're not either. And I think that there needs to be the same rationing of the screen. We just don't, I suspect far too many parents, not the sort of parents in this room, far too many parents don't actually know what's going on in their children's bedrooms. And probably, I'm afraid, they take the line of least resistance. If you started rationing, there'd be complaints. And when the children are looking at screens in their bedroom for all these hours, they're not getting up to worse nonsense. It must be true. Common sense would tell us that too much virtual reality is not enough time for real reality. I'm sure your kids, Donald, I'm sure there's no problem with them. I'm sure they do plenty of other things as well as watch screens. The screen is a supplement, a useful addition to a diet. I would call it the Harry Potter equivalent. Harry Potter, you may know, is a popular book about children and wizards and magic and evil, and they're exciting stories if you're a small child. And I think probably Harry Potter did a very, very good thing. It got millions of children all over the world to read books and to realize that there's pleasure to be had from reading books. And we have to use Harry Potter as a stepping stone to get more children reading more books, because we are in danger of losing a traditional heritage of literature, of culture. We're in danger of failing to pass that on to our children and to their children. Now, tomorrow's, what was it, your phrase, if you teach like yesterday, you'll sacrifice tomorrow. Well, there was a lot of bad teaching when I was a small boy, a lot of dreary classrooms and dreary masters, and really very low productivity. But there were also exciting teachers who communicated the joy of literature, the excitement of history, not enough science, I will say. And if we cannot afford to disregard that, and we cannot send that off to the computer. We cannot franchise that to Bill Gates. We can't franchise the heritage of thousands of years of Western civilization to a few geeks in Silicon Valley. We have to realize there's already a danger in this country that we are losing contact with a literary and cultural past. Now, I know that people of my age have always said that about young people, but I have far too many friends who are academics, people younger than me and people a lot to the left of me, which isn't hard, who say that their students don't seem to have read a book and get rather resentful when they're required to do so. Aren't there gobbets? They don't seem to be able to write a sentence. One chum of mine said he told one of his seminar groups, out of whom he'd forced an essay, that they didn't know the meaning of the word because. And I said, well, what do you talk? Of course we do. And he said, well, if you do, why is it that every time you use that word, what follows is complete gibberish? Now, the danger is that some of the great authors, I remember one friend of mine who teaches English said his children now find Jane Austen as difficult as he found Chaucer. The danger is there's an accelerating loss of contact with a literary culture. There's not actually, in the moment in Britain, and this is one of the problems and may explain the disputes between Donald and Aric, these are all new phenomena. We're talking examples in recent years. We still don't know the consequences. But one thing we do know in Britain is that the teaching of hard sciences in the state schools is in sharp, perhaps even terminal decline, which cannot be good for our future economic prospects. We are increasingly dependent for teaching the hard sciences the so-called public schools, which is, if you know Britain, actually educate about 7% of the public, and which, of course, do produce an outstanding education. One thing, I think Aric has the details, I don't, is that the public schools, naturally, they know their children are going to have computers and access to screens, but it is rationed and monitored and regulated and controlled. It is not allowed to take over their education. It's allowed to supplement their education. Now, there is where I think perhaps we can find some agreement. I know that the people in this room are not, I know you're not dumb us down. I know that you're idealists. I know that you actually believe that the technology and that you propound and that the educational techniques you use can help, and I'm sure that that must be true, and perhaps especially in the third world. But that there is a danger even there, that the contrast between the excitement of a screen, the excitement of using the screen and the computer, and the duller aspects of daily life will lead to the exaltation of one at the expense of the other. When we say that there is a danger of virtual reality taking over from reality, we're not talking about figures, we're talking about common sense. One's basic intuition tells one that that must be true. When we're in danger, when we say there's a danger of social networking taking over from social life, the same applies. So yes, the screen in its place, the computer in its place, but that means under the control of parents and educators, used as an educational tool, not allowed to take over education itself, used to increase children's knowledge of society, but not to become their sole access to society.
Thank you, Bruce. And Bruce said that we shouldn't hand literature over to geeks from Silicon Valley, but our next speaker, who I'm going to hand over to now, is a consultant from Silicon Valley, independent consultant, and he describes himself as a guide to the relationship economy. Jerry Michalski.
Thank you very much. I am your earnest representative from Silicon Valley. I think we need to place this discourse in a temporal context. We need to think about where are we in this process. And technology tends to race way far ahead of our ability to process it, to understand it, to incorporate it. And by the time technology has had its effects, it's pretty much irreversible. You can't go back to it. So Jeremy Rifkin, in one of his books, in The Absence of the Sacred, talks about the car. He has a beautiful page about the car, and he says, if we had known that the car was going to cause world wars over resources, was going to pave all our cities and change the very design of our cities, that it would separate us all in all these different ways, create suburbs, would we have allowed the car to go forward as it did? Maybe and probably not, but it happens. So I actually think I have a brighter picture to paint than that bleak picture of what actually happened to the car. And I want you to note our present attempts, and in Europe far more successful than the US, to re-engineer cities away from the car being the central object of how we get around. But when I talk about technology, social media and all these things, I say that we're in the Model T phase of this whole process. We're in this early part of a 30, 40-year process of steep, deep, difficult technological change. So we don't know how this thing plays out. We really don't. And that caveat that I just said a moment ago, that technology races far ahead of our ability to understand what it's doing to us. So there could be good outcomes, there could be bad outcomes. But what we have right now is this window. If you read Jorge Luis Borges' book, short story rather, El Aleph, the Aleph, at one point he looks through a little hole that he calls the Aleph, and he sees everything that ever happened is happening right now and will happen, all in this one moment.